I stepped off the landing craft, boots crunching the coarse red soil of the newly charted planet, and immediately felt the cold weight of isolation press down. The air wasn't toxic, but it smelled faintly of iron and burned ozone, like electricity had been trapped in the wind. Our mission had been simple, or so the briefing said: establish perimeter, scout terrain, and confirm the biome could support our research outpost. I was part of Echo Unit, one of the original teams sent for first contact operations. 10 of us, all hand-picked, trained for every conceivable contingency. Our weapons were heavy but standard, pulse rifles calibrated for the planet's gravity, but nothing in our training could prepare you for the sound that came first. A scream, not human, not animal, something in between. I spun, rifle up, scanning the jagged ridge above the landing site. At first, I thought it was a freak wind playing tricks through the crevices, but the shadows moved. Too fast, too deliberate. Then I saw them, a flock of terror birds, larger than horses, black-feathered, eyes gleaming with intelligence that sent ice through my veins. They were screaming in unison, and the sound alone was enough to make the ground vibrate. "Contact!" I shouted, adrenaline hammering. "Echo, take positions." But my words barely registered. The birds were coming down the ridge like a tidal wave, wings beating air into a roar that carried across the soil. My squad responded as trained, taking cover, opening fire. Pulses of energy lanced the air, but the beasts were fast, too fast. One of them dove directly at Ramirez. The impact crushed him against a boulder, the pulse rifle skittering out of his hands. His scream was cut short as talons raked through armor. I fired blindly, but the weight of terror and gravity was on their side, each strike precise, lethal. Fall back to the ridge," I bellowed, rallying whoever was left. I remember turning, hearing the screams of my teammates, seeing their bodies thrown like rag dolls by these enormous birds. The creatures didn't just hunt. They calculated, anticipating every move, every dodge, every attempt at suppression fire. I was the last to make it to cover, diving behind a jagged rock outcrop, chest heaving, pulse rifle trembling in my hands. The crimson soil was spattered with my unit's blood, and the birds didn't just cull, they herded, isolating anyone who tried to escape. I crouched, trying to form a plan. Their beaks and talons were built for tearing. Their speed was impossible for a human to match. The ridge offered height, maybe leverage, but it wasn't enough for a frontal assault. I glanced back toward the landing site. My comrades' bodies lay scattered, and the transport was a smoking crater from a crash landing one of the birds had caused. It was me against them. I tightened my grip on the rifle, scanning the terrain for anything I could use. A shallow crevice, a jagged slope, even a hollow in the ridge might offer temporary cover. My survival depended on stealth, patience, and exploiting the terrain, not on fighting. The first bird swooped again, claws slicing the soil where I'd been a heartbeat ago. I ducked instinctively, stomach lurching as it passed. The air smelled of burnt ozone and iron, and the screaming of my teammates haunted me. Every step forward had to be calculated. One false move, and it would be over. I inched along the ridge, low, silent, each movement masked by shadows and rock. I watched the terror birds' movements, noting their hunting patterns, how they circled, how they coordinated, how they learned. I was alone, yes, but not helpless. And if I could survive the night, maybe I could survive them. I pressed forward along the ridge, trying to keep as low as possible. Every loose stone underfoot felt like a potential death sentence. The birds were still patrolling, their cries cutting across the barren landscape, wings beating like drums. I kept my pulse steady, forcing my mind to focus on terrain, not terror. I had noticed something immediately. The birds hunted in packs, yes, but they had roles. Some scouted high, wings spread, scanning the ground below. Others moved closer to the ridge, talons scraping soil, forcing prey toward the cliffside. I had to stay unpredictable. I edged behind a rock outcrop that jutted over a steep slope. From this vantage, I could see 3 of them circling below. I held my breath and timed my movements with the rise and fall of their shadows. One screeched, and I froze, willing the sound to carry me into the ambient noise of the ridge. Minutes stretched into an hour. My stomach growled, but I didn't dare eat. Every sound was amplified, the wind across rocks, the creak of my armor, even the pulse rifle clicking softly in my grip. Then I spotted it, a narrow gorge leading down from the ridge, partially hidden by jagged stones. If I could get there, I could potentially force the birds to funnel themselves. One at a time, perhaps I could escape by making them fight the terrain rather than me. I moved slowly, testing each foothold, keeping low. A loose stone skittered down the slope. Instantly, 2 birds pivoted, heads snapping in my direction, eyes bright in the twilight. I froze, gripping the rifle tighter, calculating. A sudden gust of wind brought a cloud of dust and debris from the slope. The birds flinched. I used that fraction of a second to slip down a narrow crevice, sliding to a lower ledge. My hands were scraped raw, but I'd made it without being seen. I paused, chest heaving. Below me, the gorge yawned like a dark throat. In the shadows, I could just make out movement. 6-legged herbivores grazing near the stream, and smaller insects crawling across rocks like living patterns. I realized the planet itself wasn't empty. The ecosystem moved around these predators. I could use that too. I continued along the crevice, keeping my movements tied to natural sounds, the hum of insects, the rustle of alien plants, even the distant roar of wind through canyons. Every step was deliberate. Every misstep could mean death. Hours passed. The sun was low, and I had made it far from the ridge, though I knew the birds were still tracking me, learning me with terrifying intelligence. I rested briefly, drinking from a small stream, my hands shaking from exhaustion. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about patience, observation, and using every element of the environment to my advantage. As dusk fell, I noticed lights in the distance. Another Echo Unit outpost, possibly a forward scouting team. Relief surged, but I didn't dare run. I moved carefully, using the shadows and terrain, keeping the terror birds between me and the open terrain. They hadn't caught me yet, but they were still hunting. I was alone, exhausted, bloodied, but not defeated. And I realized that if I could make it to that outpost, I might not only survive the night, I could warn the others about the full scale of the threat we'd landed among. I pressed on, slipping further into the planet's jagged terrain, knowing there would be no rescue for hours, maybe days. Each step was calculated, every movement slow, measured. I had to survive on my wits, my observation, and whatever the planet itself offered. The first night was a lesson in patience. I found a narrow overhang to shelter under, high enough to avoid the immediate patrol patterns of the terror birds, yet low enough to remain hidden. The cold bit through my suit, and the wind carried the metallic tang of iron from the soil below. I didn't sleep. I rested in microseconds, ears straining for the faintest shift in sound. The birds were relentless. From above, I could hear the scraping of talons, the tearing of rock and vegetation, and their sharp, intelligent cries that seemed to communicate strategy. Each screech made my chest tighten, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, keeping calm. Panic would get me killed. By the second day, I had learned to use the planet's oddities to my advantage. I discovered that the 6-legged herbivores, though strange and twitchy, could be used as decoys. I threw rocks to distract the predators, guiding their attention toward a false trail while I crawled along cliffside ledges. I also learned which plants offered edible roots and sap. The water from shallow streams was bitter but drinkable. Survival wasn't about fighting. It was about observation, improvisation, and moving like a ghost. Nightfall brought the true terror. The predators moved silently now, hunting with precision. I slipped into crevices, relying on shadows and the eerie hum of alien insects to mask my presence. The larger terror birds seemed to have learned my preferred paths, cutting me off where I thought I could move safely. I had to improvise constantly, climb, duck, backtrack, and sometimes sit frozen for hours while the world hummed and shrieked around me. By the third day, hunger and exhaustion were gnawing. My legs were cramping from climbing and crouching, hands scratched raw from rocks and brush. Yet I had survived each encounter by maintaining a constant awareness. The slope of the terrain, the wind direction, the timing of the birds' patrols, the faint movements of insects and other alien wildlife that signaled danger. I began to mark subtle paths, scratches on rocks, displaced stones, bent ferns, to remember routes that were relatively safe. Every choice carried weight. One wrong step, one careless movement, and I would have become just another skeleton among the red cliffs. On the fourth day, I spotted movement ahead that wasn't the birds. A flicker of reflective material, likely a distant echo unit outpost, or a supply drop left for teams like mine. My heart leapt, but I didn't dare rush. I observed first, timing the patrol rotations of the terror birds in the distance, ensuring I wouldn't be trapped in the open. Slowly, carefully, I navigated toward it, relying on stealth, terrain, and patience. I realized that surviving this world wasn't about brute strength. It was about learning its rhythms, predicting the predators, and staying alive long enough to reach help. And somewhere deep in my mind, a single thought persisted. I wasn't just fighting for survival. I was gathering knowledge that could save future teams from the nightmare we'd stumbled into. I moved cautiously into the fifth day, the planet's alien sky overhead, stretching in shades of crimson and violet that felt almost unnatural. Each sunrise brought no relief, only the harsh light that revealed every shadow, every possible hiding spot for the terror birds. My limbs ached constantly, and my suit was tattered, but I had learned a rhythm. Move, observe, rest, repeat. I discovered a narrow canyon that offered better cover than the ridges. Its walls were jagged, but provided opportunities to climb out of sight if the birds approached. I tested every foothold, every ledge, before committing my weight. One slip could snap a leg, or worse. Food was scarce. The six-legged herbivores were skittish, always alert, and the insects were often aggressive when disturbed. I scavenged roots and small tubers, the occasional edible moss, and drank from trickling streams that I tested with caution. Water kept me alive, food kept my strength from completely collapsing. At night, I stayed pressed against rock faces, rifle ready, every muscle coiled. The terror birds had begun adapting to my tactics. They circled higher, swooping down suddenly when I thought I was safe. I learned to anticipate their dives, diving behind ledges or into crevices at the last second. Their intelligence was frightening. They weren't mindless beasts. They coordinated, learned, and remembered. By the sixth day, I was exhausted beyond comprehension, but survival instincts kept me moving. I began using the environment itself as camouflage, covering my suit with mud, moss, and even shredded bits of foliage to break my outline. Every rock, every plant, every shadow became part of my defense. One encounter nearly ended me. A bird had stalked me from the ridge above for hours. I froze under an overhang, barely breathing. Its massive shadow passed over me, talons scraping the ledge inches away. I remained still until it moved on, heart hammering, muscles trembling. I realized I was becoming more attuned to the planet's rhythms, the way the wind carried sound, the way shadows shifted at different times, the subtle cues of the local wildlife that could warn of predators. My senses sharpened, my movements more precise, more silent. On the seventh day, I stumbled across a partially collapsed ruin, remnants of a previous exploratory outpost. Supplies were minimal, but I scavenged what I could, a ration pack, a med kit, and a few tools. It was enough to stabilize myself, mend cuts, and rest without fear of immediate exposure. Every night was still tense. I slept in microbursts, always listening, always ready. The terror birds were patient hunters, but I had learned to be just as patient, just as clever. Each day of survival built on the last, a careful balance of stealth, observation, and calculated movement. By the eighth day, I felt a grim confidence. I had survived attacks that would have killed most, navigated the alien terrain, and learned enough of the predator's behavior to anticipate their moves. The outpost I had glimpsed earlier was still out there, and now I had the tools, the knowledge, and the timing to reach it without being torn apart. I knew the journey wasn't over. The terror birds were still hunting, and the planet was still alive and dangerous. But for the first time in over a week, I felt that survival wasn't just about luck anymore. It was about strategy, patience, and turning the environment itself into my ally. I left the ruin at first light, moving in silence through the canyon. The planet's second sun rose slowly behind the ridges, spilling that faint lavender light that stretched every shadow long and thin. I kept low, my camouflaged suit damp with the smell of moss and dirt. Every step was deliberate, each movement tested before I committed my weight. The terror birds hadn't given up. I could feel them watching. Sometimes I caught glimpses of them high above on the ridgelines, silhouettes that froze when I looked their way. Their patience gnawed at me. They weren't charging like the first days. They were waiting, testing me like I was their quarry in some cruel game. The land opened into rolling scrub, with low shrubs and patches of tall, grass-like stalks. It was dangerous ground, nowhere to hide, nowhere to climb. I scanned for movement constantly, eyes darting between the ridges and the distant tree line. Halfway across the open stretch, I heard it, the shrill, rasping cry that echoed across the basin. My gut twisted. That wasn't a random call. It was a signal. The pack was spreading, corralling me, pushing me toward a choke point. I dropped low, crawling into the stalks. The grass towered above me, swaying with the faint breeze. Every rustle of my body against it sounded deafening in my ears. I pushed forward slowly, rifle in hand, finger resting against the trigger. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, through the thin blades, I saw one of them. Its head rose above the grass, black eyes scanning, beak glinting. It was so close I could see the dew dripping down the feathers of its chest. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to stay still, even as the thing tilted its head, listening. It moved on. I crawled the opposite way, angling toward a rocky outcrop that jutted up like a wall a few hundred meters away. The outpost marker I'd glimpsed days ago was beyond that ridge. If I could reach it without being flushed into the open, I had a chance. But the birds didn't let me slip away so easily. Another screech tore through the air, and suddenly the grass ahead of me erupted. One of them lunged, crashing through the stalks, wings flaring as it snapped its beak inches from my face. I rolled hard, mud smearing my visor, and fired. The shot hit its shoulder, not fatal, but enough to stagger it. The others closed in, their shadows cut across the grass, their calls overlapping into a frenzy. I bolted, not toward the ridge directly, but zigzagging, forcing them to adjust. My legs burned, lungs clawing for air. I reached the rocks, scrambling up the slope, boots slipping on the grit. A talon swiped at my calf, tearing fabric, but not flesh. I swung the butt of my rifle back wildly, smashing it into the bird's skull. It shrieked, stumbled, and I pulled myself higher, wedging into a crevice too narrow for them to fit. Their screeches echoed, circling below, claws scraping stone. They couldn't reach me, but they weren't leaving either. I pressed my back to the cold rock, chest heaving, hands shaking around the rifle. The outpost was near. I could feel it, but the birds were tightening the noose. I realized then, if I didn't play this right, they would wait me out, force me to move, and tear me apart when I broke cover. I needed to flip the hunt. I stayed wedged in the rock for hours, listening. The sun crawled across the sky, burning hotter as the air shimmered with heat. Below, the terror birds never left. They prowled in shifts. 2 or 3 at a time would circle the rocks, while the others vanished into the tall grass. They knew I had to move eventually. I forced myself to think past the fear. My water ration was low, maybe a day at most if I stayed put. My body ached from the chase and from being pressed against the jagged stone. I couldn't outweight them. So I studied the land below. The slope led to a shallow ravine that funneled into a dry riverbed. The bed was full of scattered boulders, fallen logs, and jagged brush, perfect choke points. If I could draw the pack into it, force them to come one by one, I might stand a chance. I worked slowly, methodically. First, I unstrapped the motion-triggered mines from my harness, standard issue, meant for perimeter defense. I set 2 of them along the most obvious paths into the riverbed. Next, I tied the thin survival wire I carried between 2 boulders, knee-high, invisible unless you were looking for it. It took everything I had to climb down silently, to place each piece without being seen. Twice I froze as shadows passed too close, listening to claws scrape the earth. My nerves were stretched tight, but I finished. Then came the bait. I pulled a flare from my pack, struck it against the rock, and tossed it into the grass. The hiss and bright red glow cut through the silence. Immediately the birds screamed, a chorus of rage, and rushed toward it. Their heavy bodies tore through the stalks, wings flapping, snapping beaks flashing in the light. I sprinted for the riverbed, every muscle screaming, the flare smoke curling behind me.